I'm speaking in good faith today with Dr. Jason E. Shelton, professor of sociology and director of the Center for African American Studies at the University of Texas at Arlington. I can't help but notice you've got your UTA
Yes,
polo
I
on
do.
there.
I do. And
We'll
it
give,
says Center for African American Studies underneath as well. Yes, sir.
awesome. We'll give the man a raise for representing the university here. Uh, Dr. Shelton's research interests concern the sociology of religion as well as intersections of race, class, and attitudes about various political and social issues in contemporary America. He's written two books. The first one, Blacks and Whites in Christian America, How Racial Discrimination Shapes Religious Convictions. And then a new book that caught our eye that we wanted to talk about today, The Contemporary Black Church, The New Dynamics of African American Religion. So this is something that's been being discussed a lot in religious circles. The rise of the nuns and and hemorrhaging is the word we hear about
Yes.
believers from at least, or not necessarily from their faith, but at least from organized denominations.
Yes.
So this makes sense that you would say, well, how is this happening in the Black church in America compared with overall?
Yes.
And But there hasn't been a lot of data, and that's what you've tried to fill the gap with.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's a similar story to what we've heard nationally, somewhat different, where the data is very clear that whites began departing from organized religion really in the early 1970s, by the mid 70s for certain. For African Americans, we didn't start departing until the late 1990s. And my book is the first to really show that, because what I do is I analyze data from the General Social Survey, which is one of the gold standards in American survey research. And that's where, when you turn on a 6 o'clock news and you read books about what's going on with religion in America, the General Social Survey, or the GSS, is one of those data files. But what I did is I wanted to look specifically among African Americans. There's always been this trope in American society that African Americans are hyper religious. And it's true, we are very religious people, but we were not exempt from these larger trends. And I came up in the African American Methodist tradition. And I knew, just by looking around my congregation and knowing the kids that I grew up with who had left the church, like, okay, our story's not being told here. And how does that reflect in the broader data? So I grabbed the General Social Survey and I started running some data. And that ultimately is what this book has become. It's telling the Black version of this story. And it's really an important story because, as I argue in the book, all these changes that we see, not just in America overall with organized religion, but specifically within the African American community, are really important changes for us because of our history in this country and the role that the church has played in bringing about social change and driving social movements for change.
Yeah.
And so that's where organized religion has been so critical to Black America over centuries for political and social advancement, for the sense of community. And the church has been essentially that one that one institution in Black America's history that African Americans could rely on. And what does it mean now that it's declining? So those were all some of the things that helped to inspire me for this book.
You have some interesting stories, some of them just a sentence or two, but they're really quite revealing. You talk about for the decades when going to church and taking pride in dressing up and showing up, that there was a place where in this building, in this service, I have dignity and can take pride in who I am. But that some of that has changed. You know, those same gentlemen may now be at a football game together and taking pride in their team, but their team is not necessarily building them spiritually or building community.
Yep.
So it's not just an academic issue, it seems. Also, because you're a church goer, this seems to reach your heart too as well. Will you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I can talk about that, Steve, in a number of different ways. Of course, as the book opens, it begins with a family story of my grandma and my cousin and my cousin Michael and I are kids from the 1990s. and we grew up with hip hop and we grew up with mainstream American culture on television and in our earphones and headphones and listening to hip hop. And like a lot of kids who came up in hip hop in the 1990s, we learned a lot about Islam. And Michael flirted with Islam for a long time. And for grandma, like that was like a big deal.
Yeah.
Like she came up in the segregated South and the church was her institution. And for her and grandpa and just about everybody else of their generation, the church was the one place where they could call their own, where all the outside world could be filled with racism and discrimination and a lack of opportunity. But inside those four walls, there was a sense of purpose and integrity and character. And yes, we dress up here. And yes, this is our space. But as with the time would march on, it would become, African Americans would make more and more progress. And grandma would experience that progress herself in leaving the segregated South and moving to Cleveland, Ohio, and becoming a lead nurse at a major hospital. And like she would have never thought that. And my grandpa would become the first president of the local Steelworkers Association in Cleveland. And no one would have ever thought that. And they would get more opportunities in the North. And religion would remain a key piece of their lives for the arc of their lives. But for their grandchildren, it would become much more optional. And that's where we are today. And it's sort of like the success of the civil rights movement created more options for us. But the success of that civil rights movement, the challenges in the middle of all of that, no one would ever have imagined, fast forwarding the clock 50 years later, that the more opportunities that African Americans sought after, the more opportunities, the more options to live our lives, one of them would become church is optional too. That is definitely not something that folks could have imagined. But on a personal level, yeah, I mean, that's one of those stories at the kitchen table. Another story was just for my wife and I trying to find a church here once we moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And coming up in the African American Methodist tradition, the Black Methodist tradition is the first tradition. There are three traditions that comprise the historic Black church. The Black Methodist tradition was the first one that was officially established, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Church. And that's the one that I grew up in. But it's the broader Black Methodist tradition. The Baptist tradition is where most African Americans have been a part of. And even to today, most Black folks are Baptists. And then there's the Holiness Pentecostal tradition. Those are the three that are in the history of the Black church that essentially comprise it. And of course, as we know today, non-denominational Protestants have grown dramatically, and they're part of that new African American church. But when my wife and I got here to Dallas-Fort Worth and we're ready to find a church and we're ready to have our girls baptized and all of that good stuff, we had a hard time finding a Black Methodist church that had young families where we felt like we could really build community and find that camaraderie that we're used to on Sunday. And here we are in Dallas-Fort Worth. We're like, wait a minute, why is this so hard in DFW? Like, really? Like, there's one of the largest metropolitan areas in all of the U.S. And of course, we did find a church. But it was a challenge to find that church. And the church that we go to right now is about 25 minutes away in the South Dallas suburbs, in an area where it's a strong middle-class population, African-American middle-class population. And so what we found was that we kind of had to make that sacrifice to drive a little bit. That church wasn't down the street. Yeah. And so, again, that's part of the inspiration for me to write the book, because I'm realizing, wait, in the denominational tradition that I grew up in, the first one established in all of the history of Black America, I'm having a difficult time finding a congregation here for our family. And so that's part of the story, too. That's not in the book, but that's part of that inspiration along the way.
Well, you make a really great point in the book about not thinking of Black Christians as a monolith. Yes. That you've just mentioned several different denominations, including a very small smattering of Black Catholics, even in the book that you refer to. But have the different denominations been affected differently?
Oh, yeah. Great question, Steve. So the answer to your question is yes. And I think that there's a lot of research on the Black church historically, right? You hear that term, the Black church.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of books that are out there on the Black church. What I always wanted to figure out, though, is, and this is also something that appears in the book very early in the introduction, is that I remember as a kid in Los Angeles, Ohio is home, but as a kid, I grew up in LA. And I remember my parents going to a Black Methodist church called Holman United Methodist Church.
Mm.
And then they switched and went to a church called West Angeles Church of God in Christ, which is one of the big churches in LA even today. It's a Pentecostal church. And I remember going from a black, but both of these churches had in common is they were predominantly African American and they were in predominantly black neighborhoods. But when you were inside the walls of those churches, they were very different. I heard folks speaking in tongues in West Angeles. And I remember asking my mom, like, what's going on here? What language is she speaking? And my mom just kind of laughed and chuckled at my brother and I, like, what is, she's like, baby, you'll figure it out one day. But I could tell early on, just in those two congregations, that these were black people, but they were thinking about and practicing faith in very different ways. And as you fast forward the clock, 25 years later, and I become a professor, and I'm realizing there's all this research out there on the black church, but it didn't tell the story of diversity inside the church. It didn't tell the story of breaking the black church down to the sum of its parts, or the individual parts that make up that sum, to see what is the Black Methodist tradition and what are its driving parts, and what is the Black Baptist tradition. And not only that, what are those traditions, but what does it mean in today's world with the decline of organized religion, and are some traditions affected more or less by this? And the answer to that question is yes, most certainly so. That, for example, the Black Methodist tradition that I've grown up in has always been small, but it is much smaller now. It went from the early 1970s, about 16% of the black population, now down to 5% of the black population. That's a significant decline. The Black Baptist tradition has always been pretty large, as I said a few minutes ago, but it went from like 70% down to 48% now. So these are pretty significant numbers of black folks that are leaving, but you don't see the Baptist tradition leaving as much because they still got big numbers overall. If you talk to black pastors in the Baptist tradition, they know it, and ladies see it. But at the same time, that Black Catholic tradition that you mentioned, it's always been small, about 6% of the black population, but they've held their numbers pretty much. The Black Pentecostal tradition, always been small, but they've pretty much held their numbers. So it's sort of that same, what I came to realize is that same mainline versus evangelical dynamic that we see in the broader American population. It plays out right inside the black church. And there are winners and losers in terms of the denominations right there. So, it's been a fascinating story that has not been told. But what I also argue, it's much more consequential for us as African Americans because of our history and because the church has been so critical to social progress and advancement and that sense of community for African Americans.
When a lot of people think of the black church, immediately they're thinking Ebenezer Baptist.
Yes.
Or some similar flavor. And you talk not just about people deciding to leave organized religion, but even your chapter 5, Are All Sins Created Equal? It's really fascinating, just the way you sort of break it down, because it's also fracturing. Maybe you've got a better word for it, but a fracturing within a denomination of we may be more conservative or more liberal, or what are our this stance, and you can go no further past this, and all of those questions. So divisions within the fading numbers.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no question about it. And I think we see this on display within the broader United Methodist tradition in terms of its fracturing, to use your word, which I think is very accurate. But I think that's one of the great stories here is we've seen this within American Christianity overall, sort of the extent to which whether a sin is a sin. And of course, as we know, our more religiously conservative friends believe that, you're not supposed to rank sins. They're all the same in essence. A sin is a sin, which, of course, is what is said in the book. I have a number of passages that say a sin is a sin, whether we're talking about lying, whether we're talking about adultery, whether we're talking about murder. A sin is a sin. And then you've got that mainline component of the faith that's saying, wait a minute, let's figure out the reason why somebody lied. Wait, let's figure out the reason why someone did what they did. And that idea of grace is a part of that, particularly for those mainline denominations. And you see that play out very clearly among the people that I talk to, that it's not that the mainliners don't believe that things are sins. It's that they're just going to contextualize why people do what they do. And here's where you're getting to the hot button issues of homosexuality. Here's where you're getting to the hot button issues of abortion,
Right.
and the role of a woman's place in the home. And again, it goes back to that idea that Black folks are hyper religious people. That's always been the trope in American society. But when you dig a lot deeper and you break it down and you look at denominational affiliations, there's a clear and very rich diversity within Black America that's playing out right now on kitchen tables and in family reunions and in barbershops and beauty shops that just sort of say there's systematic diversity among us. And so people look at us and they say, as I was as a little kid, you say, oh, it's a lot of Black people in that church. But then you realize, wait a minute, there's a lot of systematic variation that's structured there in pattern, and it's not random that we would in ways that a lot of people might think.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about these are personal questions, but did you grow up? You grew up in the church, but were you a believer? And how has the change in the church affected your own worship or sense of community? I mean,
Oh, wow.
you've talked about moving and trying to
Yeah.
even find your denomination, but
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, as a kid, and I don't mind sharing this, as a kid, I don't know really, I went to church because mom and dad said, hey, it's time to go to church, boys.
yeah,
And so you're pulled along and you go. And so, yeah, of course, I always believed in the sense that, family always going to say that the good Lord's going to take care of you. We got to go to church and pay our respects to the good Lord and honor God. And we did that. But let me also be clear and say, my parents didn't go every Sunday. My parents they weren't new to the middle class, and that's part of an experience that my family has had. Is that I had grandparents who were college graduates, decades ago. So the idea of going to college, making it to the middle class, it was kind of already expected to us that you're going to do some of these things. So my parents had careers where they couldn't go to church every Sunday as kids in California. And we would sit in and watch Nintendo and play video games and watch Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and be happy doing it, right? And, that moment where, because again, we were of that mainline Black Methodist tradition. It says, hey, look, you can't make it today because my dad's got a report to write or my mom's got this to do. And so we're going to go next Sunday. And I can't say that I'm any different from that because my wife and I have crazy jobs. And yeah, there are going to be a number of Sundays that it's like, you know what, we ain't going to make it this weekend, girls. And the girls are like, great, Daddy, we'll go next Sunday, right? So we are definitely churchgoers, but really that mainline issue of how you navigate the broader American society. And I think that's something that's also pretty interesting for us as African Americans. So the broader arguments about religion in America have always revolved around things like modernization and secularization. And those are two terms that really haven't affected Black America very much. I mean, again, there's that trope that we're hyper religious, so we're not very secular. And then there's that idea of the modern world. Well, when you're the group like we are as African Americans that has experienced such a long history of inequality and disparity and discrimination, you don't get access to the same kinds of access to the modern world, the modern mainstream society. So that's one layer of arguments about religion and secularization. But then there's another layer I think that is really important that relates specifically to African Americans, and that's in sociology. And there's that word assimilation. And it's a word that most scholars have resisted over the decades. The word assimilation, especially at a time that we're living now, is one that's kind of resisted because it doesn't emphasize diversity. It says that we're all one and we're moving towards one. And in sociology, an argument has also been that African Americans have experienced such a strong and persistent racial discrimination that there's no way that we could assimilate. We haven't gotten the access to the mainstream society or opportunities. My point here, Steve, is that that's changing. And the data is very clear in my book that that's changing as more and more middle class African Americans who got careers and jobs and have homes in the suburbs. Now they're negotiating religion in different ways. Now they have more options in different ways. So I think what we're beginning to see, Steve, is that more and more Black folks are making it to the middle class, and they are becoming having more access to modern society. And now they are grappling with the secular world. And now you're seeing the two big waves crash, and that's the wave of modernization and secularization, and the wave of the middle class and assimilation. And I think that's where you're seeing a whole lot with religion and politics for Black Americans these days, in ways that you haven't even seen for whites the same way, because it's all crashing together at the same time with the march of modernity and the flow of assimilation.
And in a much shorter time span.
Yes, precisely. A much shorter time span,
So
right?
even
Yep,
to adjust to the pace of change. So it
yep.
sounds like you're talking about, as people got more opportunity or get more opportunity, that and opportunities for higher education or different kinds of jobs, that
Yep.
even that stratification can pull apart because people move.
Oh yes, no question about it. And so, like you mentioned earlier about my own personal walk in life, having to find a new church, having to find a new home, and all that comes with that, and that sense of community. Oh yeah, and so as more and more African Americans make it to the middle class, and opportunity takes us to different places. Again, this is part of that story, but let me not pretend like I was the first one to write about this, because I wasn't. And the legendary sociology professor E. Franklin Frazier was the first to really write about this in his classic book, The Negro Church in America. He talks about as blacks left the South and went to the North, went to places like Cleveland, where my family went, and Detroit, where
Mm.
my mother's side of the family went. Um, uh, when you left the roots of the South, which is the anchor of the historic Black church, Frazier wrote about how Black folks got to the North, and yeah, they might have gone to church every once in a while, or what kind of churches are they getting to? Who's watching over them to make sure that they get to church?
Mhm.
And so I think this is where some of that begins, really. And so it's true that the data is very clear that Black folks began to depart from organized religion in the 1990s, but we begin to see some real trickles well before then. And I think E. Franklin Frazier began to capture that. And it's that broader sociological. It's not just about choices that people make, but there's some broader sociological factors that are shaping and drive organized religion. And we began to see that with Black folks with some of his early writings.
So you're building on what research had been done, writing and thinking from earlier decades. Was there anything that really surprised you in this research that sort of like,
Wow.
whoa, I didn't know that. I
You
wasn't
know,
expecting.
I didn't have, you're probably right, Steve, that there was something that was the wow moment, but really what got me was how right E. Franklin Frazier was. And so it's kind of like when you, so in the arc of African American scholarship, the name W.E.B. Du Bois is the name that most of us know. He's the legendary sociologist who would write so many books and be the first Black man to get a PhD at Harvard, and he did amazing work. Um, but I think along the way there have been some other, some really great Black scholars whose names we've sort of forgotten about, and I think E. Franklin Frazier is one of those. In the shadow of the great W.E.B. Du Bois, people like Frazier have been sort of lost, and he's been lost for that reason, and for the reason of W.E.B. Du Bois. But I think when I picked up his book, and I really started, he did what I wanted to do, and that was to break down the Black church into its individual components. And he talks about the Methodists, and he talks
Hmm.
about the Baptists, and he talks about the Great Migration to the cities, and he talks about how moving up in social class could impact how people were a part of organized religion. He didn't get that credit, though. Right? He didn't get that
Hmm.
credit. And so that's what I was really surprised to see, Steve, is to go back into this classic book, and say, wow, this dude was really on it, and we've sort of forgotten about him.
I can see why people enjoy taking your classes.
I
You are into your subject and have a
appreciate that,
passion
Steve.
for it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
How does I guess you started by talking about your grandma a
Mhm.
little bit, and you actually end the book talking about being at her funeral. So here's someone
Yeah.
who really lived the
Yes.
civil rights movement,
Yes.
and so now you're a generation who knows the people who were there, but
Yes.
you came later,
Yes.
and so I guess a tradition can't help but change. But you talk about being there and sort of resisting joining in the post-funeral conversations about Black Lives Matter and what about this political issue and all of this. What were you thinking as you stood there and were hearing these later generations having just said goodbye to the civil rights generation, if I can call
Yeah,
your grandma that?
yeah. Oh, grandma is definitely that. It was. I think this is I think Black America is at a major tipping point, and that's one of the themes I sort of get at in the book is that generational divides. I mean, generational divides have kicked in some very significant ways. Um, I had the privilege, Steve, of having all four of my grandparents until I was 28 years old.
Mm.
I mean, it's just amazing. I know very few people who've had that luxury. I got to know them all so well, and they all had some sort of, with the exception of one, my mother's mother had all roots in the Deep South. My grandma Margie's side had left the Deep South before that and were already living in Detroit and already going to racially integrated schools in Michigan. So Grandma Margie's walk in life was even different than that of my grandma Elizabeth Shelton's walk in life. Two young Black women who, one in the North, one in the South, and very different upbringings, and very different American experiences or African American experiences for their day. But I guess what I just realized is that, you you go to the funeral, you experience all of this, and then you're witnessing the passing of a generation. And my daughters, for example, I've got two daughters, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. They know our family history, and they knew Grandma Shelton before she died, but she's the only one that they knew, right? And so the idea is that those anchors are gone.
Mm.
And those were the anchors in Black America that when Black History Month comes around, or when you're sitting around the kitchen table and you need to hear those stories about discrimination or those stories of trial and tribulation or those stories that connect you to the broader narrative, your own family and those people, your own family, those people are gone. So these young African Americans in today's world don't know that narrative. They don't have a personal connection to segregation the same way. And their parents might tell a lot of those stories, but they can't do it the same way because they didn't live through it. Now, maybe those are the good days, right? America has come a long way. That we have definitely, as grandma would always say, we've come a long way, but we got a long way to go. So
Mm.
definitely those are good stories to know the positive stories about the hospital and the great things that would happen for her. But at the same time, those cultural anchors are gone. So here I was at the funeral, like, wow, I'm realizing she's the last one. Like grandma was the last of the four grandparents. How do I move on knowing that those four anchors that were there? I love my mom and dad to death, no question. They're both still with me. I don't want them going anywhere, but they weren't their own parents. And even they will say that, right? Everybody loves grandma and grandpa. And so how do you move on without them? And I think those are sort of those issues to grapple with, not just individually, but as anchors in a culture,
Mm.
anchors in an experience in America that's your connection to the motivation in life. So my grandparents would always say, hey, look, boy, you got it easy. Go out there because you didn't have to deal with what we had to deal with, right? You got far more opportunity out there. So go out there and go and do that and make us all proud. And those are that sort of motivation, that inspiration of hearing them tell their stories that would inspire us to go out and make our dreams come true.
Mm. You quote frequently from just a whole bunch of different reverends and pastors and other religious leaders within the church in the book,
Mhm.
which gives it a really nice flavor because I'm hearing from different perspectives.
Yes.
Did you hear something in their words and their stories that they still had hope while they watch the decline in numbers, or was there something that gives you hope for the Black church? I mean, I don't
Wow.
suppose anything can stay the same as history
Right.
changes and life
Yeah.
changes, but
Steve, that's a really good question. And I'd have to think about that one a little bit more too. You caught me off guard with that one. And that's a
mm,
good thing. Um, I think so. Most of the people that I interviewed, or just about all the people that I interviewed, were people specifically for this particular book. I wanted to get a wide range of different people from different backgrounds, different denominational affiliations, people who left organized religion. I talked to atheists. I talked to agnostics. I talked to one guy who described himself as not spiritual but not religious but not spiritual. And I'll leave it to the viewers to go pick up the book to figure out what they think that might mean. But one of the things I really found that was interesting was listening to people who, so here's where you get to, so in the end, Steve, I have to be honest and say that I have a very pessimistic view of, the book ends on a sort of a pessimistic view of organized religion and what the future holds. And I say that, and I do that because the data speaks very loudly about change happening in Black America. And again, the change is so strong that when you just, for example, look, as I did near the end of the book, and you look at African Americans who are age about 25 and younger, so just a very small group between people between ages of 18 and 25, and looking at their religious affiliations and the trends in religion, only like 2% of them say that they affiliate with the African American Methodist tradition. That means we're pretty much on our deathbed if that's the case, right? 2% of the adult population being Black Methodists. We're in a lot of trouble. And not only that, the Black religious non-affiliates, the nuns that you mentioned, are now the largest denomination, the largest religious tradition among that small cohort of people who are 25 and 18, between ages of 18 and 25. What gives me some hope, though, is that despite all the pessimistic numbers, is that people still look for community. And so when I talk to the atheists and I talk to the agnostics in my book, they're still saying that we need a gathering place. We need something to bring people together, because otherwise we're just going to be running around out here on our own individual islands.
Well, you even mentioned an actual group of Black non-believers, like forming a community. I guess they can't call it a church, but
yes, they can't call it a church. They refuse to call it a church, and it's not a church. But there's this national group called Black Non-Believers, and it is growing, and they're realizing how people still need community, and what they're trying to do is establish that. And that's the one thing that does give me hope, is that my ultimate fear, regardless of my sense of faith, put that aside, because I'm a nerdy professor and I've got to listen to the data and represent the data. But what I also want is for people to have community. I don't like the idea of people being islands on their own. I hate the idea that, you go out to, my wife and kids and I will go out to eat at a restaurant, Steve, I know you see this too, and people got their cell phones at the table next to you and they're not talking at all, but they're just on their cell phone. Like, how do we break that? How do we get back to a sense of community in some way? And religion is the best way to bring about a lot of that community. For African Americans, the Black church has shown that's the case. The Black church is essentially the main institution that reaches out to all these other smaller institutions that connect African Americans, regardless of our denomination, regardless of whether you're middle class or poor, regardless of what you do for a living, regardless of how much education you have. The church has been that vein. Well, as the church declines, what replaces that? And that's where I think it is the information for African Americans is so critical. But in the end, we're talking about community. And even if the atheists and agnostics are looking for community, that's at least some kind of connection among people that at least gives me hope for the future.
Because our title is In Good Faith, and we listen to how people see God working in their lives in different ways. I'm wondering, is there something you feel, I don't know that you could quantify this academically, but what do you know now spiritually or about God that you didn't know when you were a kid growing up and mom and dad saying, let's go on?
That's a good question, Steve. What do I know now? Let's just say I know that the good Lord's been there all the time. I'll just put it to you like that. The good Lord's been there all the time. Steve, if you would have told me this had been my life, that I would, man, Steve, now you're going to catch me as not Dr. Jason Shelton, but as the homeboy Lil J that all my friends know. and they would say, "Little Jay, we knew you were going to be all right in life, but who would have known, Steve? I went to graduate school. I didn't do any research on religion. I was writing on religion and politics and the growth of the African American middle class. I built a career studying religion, right? You just never know. But as Grandma would say, baby, hang in there and keep going because the good Lord is going to do good work. And that's what's happened in my life. And so that's what I would say, Steve, is that I didn't know then. I still don't know, but I'm still walking that path because my family always said, stay on that path, keep your rear end in church, and keep your prayers going, and let the good Lord do good work. And that's exactly what's happened. That's what I didn't know then, and that's what I definitely know now.
Mm. Jason, is there something I should ask you that I didn't know to ask you, or that you'll think, gosh, I wish we got to this or that?
The one thing that I probably would say, and you tell me if you think this is relevant or not, is that while the nuns have declined, have increased so much, and the Black Methodist tradition and Baptist tradition has fallen, as we know, the non-denominational Protestant tradition has grown dramatically. And these are the most well-to-do African Americans. So earlier, when I talked about assimilation, the Black folks who are non-denominational Protestant, the Black Methodist tradition I grew up in used to be viewed as the Black bourgeoisie.
Mm.
We have nothing on those Black non-denominational Protestants. I mean, they're better educated, far more income, more likely to live in the suburbs. Not only that, far more likely to vote for Republican presidential candidates, whereas, of course, the Baptists and the Methodists are far more likely to vote for Democratic candidates. So what we see is the fastest growing denomination within the Black church is very much so a part of mainstream American society. And I think,
is there more integration in congregations? Because
oh yeah,
that's another way of.
oh yeah, they don't see the distance between Black non-denominational Protestants. They don't feel like there's a same kind of distance between them and white America the way that there is for members of those historic denominations. And so I do think if there was something to talk about, particularly the fact that we talked about assimilation earlier, is that fastest growing tradition in Black America is very affluent. Their politics are very different from those of the members of the historic congregations or historic denominations. There's a story in there in terms of diversity among us as Black folks within the faith.
Mm. Well, thanks for your good work on this book. The book is The Contemporary Black Church, The New Dynamics of African American Religion. Dr. Jason Shelton, UTA shirt and all. So thank you so much for speaking with me today in good faith.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Enjoyed the conversation.